Hi, and welcome to the GAI online lecture series. I'm Josh Wright, University Professor at Scalia Law and Executive Director of the Global Antitrust Institute. In today's lecture, we're going to give you a primer on market definition and antitrust. We're going to cover three topics. The first is why we define markets at all, the purpose of defining markets, both from an economic and legal perspective. We're going to talk a little bit about understanding the difference between monopoly power, the ability of a firm to reduce market output or raise market price to affect market conditions, to be distinguished from a narrower concept that economists sometimes call market power. And that's going to be the power over one's own price that comes with downward sloping demand and that most firms in the modern economy have. Sometimes these terms are used in confusing ways in antitrust opinions, even among experts. So we're going to do a little bit of nomenclature cleanup to talk about the difference between the two, why it matters. This is in the market definition section in large part because the purpose of what we're going to do in market definition is we're trying to identify what firms are constraining the competitive decisions of other firms. What are the constraints on a firm's ability to affect market conditions? So that search for monopoly power and constraints on the exercise of monopoly power is going to be a lot about what antitrust is about. And the market definition exercise done properly helps us focus our analysis on the appropriate candidate restraints for the exercise of monopoly power. And finally, we'll spend most of today's lecture working through some of the analytical tools, at least introducing some of the analytical tools we use to define markets. The two most common being the hypothetical monopolist test and critical loss analysis. You'll see in follow-up sessions that we'll put online on unilateral effects analysis and other contexts, you'll see some follow-up lectures on how to define markets in practice, some empirical methods, and some examples in different types of mergers and monopolization cases. So really today, I'm going to spend some time getting those concepts introduced to you, providing a foundation for those later lectures. Let's start with why we define markets at all in the first place. Antitrust has really come around on this question. If you were to ask that question, why do we define markets even 30 years ago, maybe even 20 years ago, but certainly if we go back further than that, we have a really simple answer. Early antitrust was very structural in nature. Most of what we did was we counted the number of firms with our fingers. Maybe we calculated a market share or a concentration measure like an HHI if we were getting fancy. And we had some thresholds for what number of firm or what concentration level was too much. And so the reason we defined markets is we had to draw a circle around what firms were in the market and what firms out, because you can't calculate market shares without knowing what the market is, right? We calculate a market share. The denominator is the number of total sales in the market. The numerator, the sales of the merging firms. Well, we have to figure out the denominator, right? So a lot of early antitrust market definition was all about being able to calculate market shares, because most cases rose and fell. Wins and losses were determined by concentration measures. Fast forward to the 2010 merger guidelines and even into practice in the agencies in the mid and late 90s, it's really not what modern antitrust is about. It's really no longer about simple calculations of shares. We'll use them sometimes, particularly in the coordinated effects setting. But for example, in unilateral effects and in other areas of antitrust, we really have downplayed or downgraded the notion of using market shares to infer competitive effects, and instead we have some more direct measures. So a newer answer to why we define markets is to provide an analytical framework to identify the nature and sources of competition and how the conduct or the transaction at issue might affect consumers. We're looking for sources of competitive constraint. Most of antitrust is about the exercise of monopoly power, raising market prices and reducing market output. And we're looking for what firms might constrain the ability of our target firm, probably our defendant or firm under investigation, is constrain their ability to do so. The market definition is no longer really an end unto itself, but it can sharpen our competitive effects analysis. We can identify, sort of paint the picture of who competes in this space, which firms are a constraint for other firms, where should we be looking in our search for potential competitive constraints on the exercise of monopoly power for some particular merger or conduct that we're interested in. Former DOJ economist, longtime former DOJ economist Greg Worden has a paper on making the case for market definition, where I think he puts that concept quite nicely. Right? What we do is we define a market because it helps us clarify the claims we're interested in testing and facilitate their assessment. The market definition structure, the analytical structure, and we'll walk through that structure together, he says is a useful rhetorical and analytical device for bringing analytical order to real world chaos. We'll have a mess of numerical, qualitative, quantitative data, documents, statements from CEOs about mergers allowing them to take over the world, statements from other CEOs about being able to enter the market. We'll have lots of different types of data, and market definition helps us sort of clean up and organize that data in a way that can be useful for analyzing the competitive claims at issue. Let's sort of move ahead to understanding monopoly power and market power and sort of really what this market definition exercise is all about. And I want to start by just sort of going through a little bit of a thought experiment, right? If we think about, I'm a big coffee drinker. I've got a coffee right off screen. And if we think about the idea of whether a firm has market power, I want to be a little bit careful here. Economists define market power. If we sort of scroll through your microeconomics textbook, you'll have a demand chapter and supply chapter and equilibrium chapter, and you'll learn something about perfect competition. If you look through our GAI online lecture series catalog, you'll see we've got a lecture introducing the models of perfect competition and monopoly, the sort of two analytical poles that are in most applied micro textbooks. Right? And the way economists usually define market power is deviations from perfect competition. One of the results you'll see in these models of perfect competition, think about infinite firms, none different from the other, all identical, is that we get a price equal to marginal cost. Right? Now, that description, an infinite number of identical firms, doesn't look like any market that you or I know or sort of participate in the real world. And economists used it sort of like physicists thought of wind tunnels, right? Assume away all of the frictions and let's study the way that markets allocate resources. Perfect competition model, really useful for that. Not really useful for doing antitrust analysis, not a useful benchmark for measuring anything. Because in our real world, all firms that we interact with have some sort of downward sloping demand, some more steep than others, some more differentiated from others, right? But most firms that we see in the real world, if not all, sort of face downward sloping demand, and that means are able to have price greater than marginal cost, right? And so does Starbucks have market power? Well, think about it this way. The opposite of market power, perfect competition, is a perfectly horizontal demand curve. Think about what that means. Means if they raise their price a penny, their sales drop to zero. And that's not true. Well, why isn't it true? It's not true. Think about you're sort of walking to get your morning coffee. And if you knew Starbucks had raised the price a penny, a nickel, what have you, some of you prefer Starbucks to walking across the street to Panera or Cosi or Caribou Coffee or Dunkin' Donuts for my East Coast people watching the video. Right? Some of you have preference for Starbucks. For some of you, it's convenient because it's closer. You don't want to cross the street, etc. Right? And so we've got differentiation. Sort of maybe you like the barista or the free Wi-Fi or the snacks that are offered. Right? Lots of ways in which firms differentiate and consumer preference sort them into these sort of different stores and product offerings. Right? So all firms have that. To some degree, and we've got that downward sloping demand. So does Starbucks have power over its own price, meaning to face a downward sloping demand curve? Absolutely, right? And so that price greater than marginal cost is sort of the economic definition of market power. and it's horribly boring for antitrust purposes, right? Those markups that the distance between the price and the marginal cost we'll use, and we'll talk about how to use them. But firms with really small market shares can have market power. The example I like to use with my class at Scalia Law is for a while back, LeBron James used to offer some a cologne product, right? And there's other examples of this. Michael Jordan or Ronaldo, if you like soccer, offered a cologne product, huge price over marginal cost. If we think about their share in the overall men's cologne market, really, really small. But the people who want it don't think there's a close substitute, right? If you want to buy LeBron James or Ronaldo cologne, you don't want a cologne from Steph Curry or Messi, right? So there's a small number of buyers who have sort of intense demand, and we have really sort of steep demand, big price over marginal cost, but we wouldn't think about LeBron James being able to control market conditions and market output, right? So does Starbucks have market power? Absolutely. But most of antitrust will mean something different than just downward sloping demand curves. What about does Starbucks have monopoly power? Right? Does it have the ability to control market output and market prices? Now we're thinking about what happens when Starbucks raises its price. Where do people substitute? Can Starbucks raise price profitably? Right? Some people will substitute to other coffee houses. Maybe they'll go make their coffee at home, or they'll go drink tea instead, right? So for now, I just want to separate those two phenomena. We've got control over one's own price, sort of economic market power, price greater than marginal cost, and let's distinguish that from the ability to control market output and market price. I'm going to refer to that as monopoly power. You'll hear different people in antitrust use different terms. They'll say things like antitrust relevant market power as a synonym for monopoly power. I'm just going to say monopoly power on the one hand for market changes, and market power for ability to control one's own price, okay? So we've got those two ideas in hand, and let's take them. We've got sort of our case for defining markets. We've got this sort of background rationale of what we're searching for, constraints on the exercise of monopoly power, right? Now let's talk a little bit in more detail about the tools that we have to diagnose these things for the purpose of market definition. I want to say in the beginning that, remember I talked a little bit about this old approach to market definition. We define a market, we calculate shares, and we're basically done, right? Most of antitrust, we predict whether a merger substantially lessened competition, so the statutory language under Section 7 of the Clayton Act. But the same holds for Section 1 and Section 2 cases, or cases in any jurisdiction, right? We had a market definition phase where we would calculate shares and determine whether we've got market power or monopoly power or dominance or whatever the language in the jurisdiction is. And then we've got this kind of phase 2 subsequent step of the analysis where we do competitive effects, right? So in the early era of antitrust, the sort of structural era, the market definition was everything. Now, it's not everything now. It sets us up and sharpens our competitive effects analysis, but it's still a lot, right? So I've got examples of sort of US mergers up on your slide. FanDuel, DraftKings, T-Mobile, Sprint was a big one recently. Staples, Office Depot, is the market office supply superstores or office supply sold through office superstores? In Whole Foods, Wild Oats, is it premium natural organic supermarkets, or do those firms really compete against all supermarkets? Blockbuster in Hollywood. For some of you might be too young to remember walking into a Blockbuster video to go get your VHS tape, and we weren't all stuck at home watching Netflix. But a big question was, who are those when those firms propose to merge? Who do they compete against? What are the other sources of movie content and other forms of entertainment content? Is it going to the movies? Is it downloading things online? And if we've got a market that's just sort of video rental stores, those guys are going to have a big share, and it might be determinative. And if we're looking a little bit broader or predicting changes into the future of what's the substitute, close enough substitute, and what's not, we might think about it a little differently. So still, market definition is a pretty high stakes, important part of what we do in these cases and others. a fun aside on Blockbuster and Hollywood. We're now down to one Blockbuster video, sort of famously the last Blockbuster in all the land. So it's possible to get these predictions of massive monopoly power and permanent market power and charging the monopoly price. It's possible to get these things wrong, but one of the market definition sort of functions is to help us focus on where the substitutes are now, where they might be coming from, and what consumer behavior is going to be in the face of a price increase, right? So I already confessed to my coffee drinking habit. So most of my examples are going to be coffee based, just to help us walk through some of these analytical tools. So think about, I've got two coffee chains, Starbucks and Caribou. And for those watching from outside the US, I think you all know what Starbucks is, but think about Caribou as a sort of local national chain coffee shop. And I've got this picture up that is what economists call product space. So I've kind of simplified the world, quality on the x-axis and product price on the y-axis, and you can think about different firms and substitutes being located at different points in that space. So this is my picture of product space. Yours might vary. So if you think about quality, Starbucks is pretty good and pretty expensive. I've got the fun sort of craft barista made coffee where they drew the foam bear in the corner there. That's even higher quality and higher priced than Starbucks. And you can sort of see other chains. And I see the New York people getting angry with me for having Dunkin' Donuts as relatively low quality. I'm a California guy, so you're stuck with me. Instant coffees and the like down in that left-hand corner. So we have lots of heterogeneity in where firms are located. Now, in the old structural days of antitrust, if we had this Caribou-Starbucks merger, we might break out our fingers and maybe in this case our toes, because we have more than 10, to count up the number of firms. Maybe we would draw a circle around that whole space, start to calculate shares, and kind of be done, right? What we're interested in doing for our market definition purpose is sort of playing around with different candidate markets, not just for the shares, but to understand the question we're really interested in is, does that post-merger firm, the one about which I have that rectangle, Starbucks buys Caribou and now owns both brands, are they going to be able to raise price and reduce output in some market? Do we mean the whole market for all coffee? Maybe there's a high-end coffee market, right? We'll sort of exclude, I've excluded Dunkin', but also maybe the Keurig cups and the Folgers and sort of instant coffee and so forth, right? And the reason that we're doing this market definition exercise now, it's not so much for the purpose of calculating shares, but it's really about identifying if Starbucks and Caribou increase price post-merger, where are the places we should be investigating where consumers might switch to defeat that price increase, right? It's the closer substitutes. One of the analytical errors in the structural approach, and one of the reasons why it's fallen out of fashion in economists, even though remnants of it still are certainly sprinkled around the law and even agency guidelines, one of the reasons why that structural approach, counting the firms with our fingers, has fallen out of fashion is it would treat a close substitute, take Coffee Bean on the screen in front of you, right? Pretty close substitute to Starbucks and Caribou. We might think about consumers in the face of a post-merger price increase by Starbucks sort of switching away to Coffee Bean in greater numbers than, say, instant coffee to Folgers, a much more distant substitute. The structural approach, when we say it's a 13 to 12 merger, or a 5 to 4, or a 6 to 5, or a 3 to 2, we're kind of treating all those firms as homogeneous blobs. We know that's not right. We know customers have heterogeneous preferences and they treat these firms differently. And most of our modern approaches, and again, we'll come back to this when we do videos on unilateral effects analysis, treat firms as differently. We care about the closeness of substitution, not just whether you're sort of in a binary way a substitute or not, right? And so most modern approaches are flexible about closeness of substitution, and then we try to measure that in different ways. And most of the structural approaches ignore that, and we sort of do a more gross counting with our fingers. Again, function of the market definition analysis, find out who's actually a competitive constraint and who's not. Two tools we'll spend time talking about how to do that. One's the hypothetical monopolist test, and the other we'll talk about critical loss analysis, which is related. So two parts of market definition: product market and geographic market. A really useful thing if you are a lawyer in the US, pull out the 2010 merger guidelines, read the sections on product and geographic market as sort of a companion to this if you're trying to get a refresher on market definition. I'm mostly going to focus on the tools, but a really useful and important thing to understand the language used in the guidelines, and you can sort of have it out next to you while you're watching, might be a useful thing to do. I'm going to talk mostly about product market. You'll see the dynamics work the same in the geographic context, but I'll talk a little bit about that as we go through. But let's talk about how the HMT, the hypothetical monopolist test, works in practice. So with those handy merger guidelines, they define the hypothetical monopolist test as the test requires a hypothetical profit maximizing firm, right? Our hypothetical monopolist likely would impose at least a small but significant and non-transitory increase in price, we're going to call that a SNP, on at least one product in the market. Okay, so a couple of things here, right? What we're going to do, and I can go back to my coffee example, my coffee picture in a second. Say we are interested in finding out whether that high-end coffee circle was an antitrust market. We would draw that circle. We would assume a hypothetical profit maximizing firm owned all of the firms inside the circle, right? And then we would say, could that firm profitably impose a SNP? Could it increase price profitably? Okay. Let me go back to that picture so we can see it, right? So here's that picture. So is there a high-end coffee market? What's the HMT mean we're doing? It means we're, even though I'm doing this analysis, and this is a common mistake, so listen carefully, even though we're doing this analysis, the hypothetical monopolist test is not asking what Starbucks is going to do after the merger. That's competitive effects. And we'll get there, and a lot of the questions will sound similar. But notice this difference is it's a little bit important, right? The hypothetical monopolist test is an imaginary firm, a hypothetical monopolist, that controls that entire circle, and we say, could it impose a 5% or a SNP profitably? Think about the two things that are determining whether we can do that profitably. There's a trade-off we're trying to measure, right? Is it profitable for the monopolist? What are the benefits to the monopolist of that price increase? The benefits to the hypothetical monopolist? Well, it's going to raise price by the SNP. I'm just going to use 5%. So the margin's going to go up 5% on all the sales it keeps. That's the benefit, right? Extra 5% margin on all the sales it keeps. It's going to make fewer sales. Demand curve slope downward. It raised the price. Quantity demanded goes down, right? And so some people are going to switch from inside that circle to outside. They're going to go to Dunkin', Keurig, Folgers. They're going to leave the market and go drink tea, okay? So there's cost and benefits of that price increase. The hypothetical monopolist test is comparing the cost to the benefits. If it is profitable for my hypothetical monopolist to raise the price, we have that circle's a market, okay? Why? What we're really saying is when we draw that circle, there are not close enough substitutes outside the circle to defeat a price increase, right? The price increase that we're talking about for the hypothetical firm is really our test of saying, if so many would switch to Dunkin', that it would defeat a small price increase, Dunkin's a close enough substitute in consumers' mind that we really ought to have them in the market. Let's draw the circle again and do the test again. That's the logic of the HMT, okay? So a couple of things. And I just fell into this a couple of minutes ago. I automatically equated the SNP to a 5% price increase. And you'll hear antitrust people do that quite a bit. Oftentimes we use 5 as a starting point. In some markets, the retail settings where a 5% increase in the margin is huge, right? We're talking about margins that might be 1 or 2%. We might use a smaller number for a SNP. These are not sort of written on stone tablets. The guidelines use the SNP concept. It's to get the idea of, close enough to be in or out. It's a qualitative, somewhat arbitrary number that we pull. 5 is the most common in practice. It can be smaller. There's some practical judgment to be used here, and one can engage with the agency about what the or court even about what the appropriate SNP might be for getting at that small but significant non-transitory price increase. Okay. another point that's sort of tucked into the assumptions in the HMT. We're talking just about demand substitution. So I won't go back on the slides again, but when you're thinking about that picture, we're not thinking about, when I'm answering the question, if the hypothetical firm raised the price, will it be profitable? I'm just thinking about who switches and who stays, right? Demand substitution. Who switches to substitutes and who stays. Other things are going to happen in the market and we know it. Firms are going to enter. Firms are going to reposition inside that product space. They're going to compete all sorts of different ways. In the market definition stage, we're assuming that away. We'll get back to it on competitive effects. We'll do entry. We'll do repositioning. We'll let firms compete. We'll kind of untie their hands from behind their backs. But a market definition, we're just sort of saying who's close enough that they count. Who should we be studying right now? Okay. The conceptual underpinnings are just like we said, right? We're going to test to see whether products 2 or 3 belong in the market. We start by drawing a circle around 1. And if 2 is close enough, right, then when our hypothetical monopolist of firm 1 raises the price, enough consumers leave 1 and go to 2 to defeat the price increase. If that's true, that it was not profitable to increase the price because lots of people would switch to 2, then 2 belongs in the same market. That's sort of the fundamental logic. Okay. What we're trying to do is to do that in an iterative way, right? So we might start with a small market for product 1. We test and we say, will enough people substitute to 2 to render the price increase profitable or unprofitable? If it's profitable, we stop, and the market for product 1 is its own market. If it's unprofitable, then product 2 is in. Okay, now I draw a circle around 1 and 2. Now let's test product 3, right? So this is sort of an iterative process. We'll sort of keep on drawing larger and larger circles until we get to an answer that is yes, the price increase would be profitable. Okay, and so it may be something where we start and we guess small and we sort of go bigger. Okay. One brief note on cluster markets. I won't cover it a lot right now, but just sort of to have it out there for you as a foundational concept. Oftentimes, our product markets, I've sort of done them separately. I've done product 1, product 2, product 3. Sometimes in the real world, we bundle markets together for convenience. So think supermarkets, hospitals, office superstores. What I'm really looking for when I go to the supermarket is not just the coffee that I'm going to buy, but I'm going to get coffee, milk, and some produce and so forth and so on. Okay. And so I'm really looking at a bundle of complex products that are complementary. Okay. That happens a lot in hospital merger cases where it's really the suite of services being offered. So just to sort of put that out there for you, that cluster markets are something that we use sometimes for analytical convenience and certain merger cases. And in later lectures with some more advanced applications, we can talk about when it's appropriate and not appropriate to use cluster markets. Okay. So let's shift towards a different tool in the toolkit to talk about market definition. Right? And there are more than what we're going to go over today in terms of primers. You'll see a couple of things talked about in the cases. Sometimes we'll do sort of the handy functional substitute test. You'll see courts often citing language from Brown Shoe, a case from the 60s, say one of the ways that I identify whether products are close enough substitutes to be in the same market is I look at them. I hold both up and I say, look, here's coffee and here's tea. Are they close enough? They're both liquid. They both have some caffeine. They're both, mostly drunk warm. Close enough or not? And we get some sort of qualitative, subjective judgment. And that still happens, right? You get to focus on the reasonable interchangeability of the products. Modern antitrust has shifted more to the sort of HMT and test based on the economic logic of the HMT, but sort of just to put that out there for you, we'll get this functional substitutability language, and we'll also see qualitative evidence. Does the CEO at Starbucks think of Caribou or Folgers as being in the same market? Do they watch their prices? Do they watch their competitive decisions? Do they react to competitive decisions of just Caribou, of Dunkin', of Keurig, right? And so we'll get customer competitor testimony documents that can be useful to this economic story. I'm going to focus here mostly on the economics. And there's a couple pieces that we can rely on that now, instead of just using our economic theory, we can get some data too, right? So measurable consumer behavior, remember, market definition is all about demand substitution. When Starbucks raises its price, where do people go, right? If lots are going to Folgers, well, maybe Folgers is a close enough substitute, it belongs in the market. And if not, probably not, and maybe we have some other market. But these are empirical questions, right? Is where do people go, right? Where do they switch in response to price changes? Well, great and fun, interesting thing about modern antitrust is we oftentimes have data that help us answer these questions. Okay? And these other three things you see there, critical loss analysis, merger simulation, and entry-exit experiments, are three different ways that we might use those data. Professor Kobayashi is going to do a session on entry and exit experiments using some recent cases and talk a little bit about quantitative methods. We'll do a lecture on merger sim at some point. It's a little bit more of an advanced topic, and so we'll put together some material on that as well. I'm going to focus today mostly on critical loss analysis, sort of as a fundamental tool here, right? Actual consumer data is not always available, right? In industries where we've got scanner data, retail, hospitals, and the like, we can oftentimes get scanner data or data on customer behavior, other forms of data on customer behavior in response to price changes. Remember, that's really what I want. I want, where do customers go in response to a price change, okay? And so we'll talk about one thing we can do with customer data. I think of this usually as an implementation, a specific implementation of the hypothetical monopolist test, and you'll see why in just a second. Introduced by Barry Harris and now Chairman Joe Simons back in the late 80s, here's what the critical loss analysis question asks, and you'll sense the similarity to the HMT when you read this language. Given a price increase of X%, we could use 5 if you like, what would the percentage loss in unit sales have to be to make the price increase unprofitable? Remember when we just did the hypothetical monopolist test, what did we ask? Something really similar. We said, if a hypothetical monopolist raises the price by 5%, a snip, I'll just use 5, by 5%, would the price increase be profitable, or would so many consumers switch away from the hypothetical monopolist firm's products that it would render the price increase unprofitable, right? We're concerned with this sort of tipping and balance, right? If enough consumers switch away, then the price increase is unprofitable, and we know the market should be more broad. If the price increase is profitable, we've got ourselves a market because our candidate substitute is too distant a substitute to constrain the increase in price. We've got some monopoly power there, right? Okay, so we're doing the same thing in the CLA analysis. Given a price increase of 5%, X%, how much, what's the break-even number, right? Then we're going to call that the critical loss, right? What's the break-even number in the number of unit sales that the firm would have to lose in order to make the price increase unprofitable? Another way of asking the HMT question. Same focus on two effects. What are the benefits of the price increase? Increased margin on the sales I keep. I call those inframarginal sales. What's the loss? I'm going to lose some sales when I increase the price. Demand curve slope downward, right? We're going to switch away. We're going to lose some sales, okay? We're going to see which one of those is bigger. And critical loss, just like HMT, is interested in seeing whether the value of 1, the gains from the price increase, are larger than 2, the losses associated with the price increase. Right, so we've got this intuition now on this spectrum in front of you, right? When we have the increase in price, there's some amount of loss of sales that will render the price increase unprofitable. We're going to call that the critical loss. If we lose any less than that, so look at on our spectrum there to the left of critical loss, well, we haven't lost enough sales, so the price increase is still profitable. So to the left of critical loss is profitable. Break even at the critical loss point, we've lost just enough unit sales that the effect of the price increase is 0 on profit. And to the right, now we've lost enough sales to render the price increase unprofitable, okay? And so we're looking for where that critical loss is, and you can get the intuition for where this is going. Once we know the critical loss, we're going to try to compare it to the actual loss. If the actual loss is greater than the critical loss, it means the price increase is unprofitable, right? That's where we're going, the same as the HMT logic, right? We're calculating the profitability of a SNP, just like the HMT. We calculate step one, calculate the critical loss. This is the amount of unit sales a hypothetical monopolist would need to lose, right? And we normally do this as a matter of theory, right? We know the margin for the firm. We say it increases that margin by 5%. How many sales would it need to lose to break even? We can sort of calculate that on the back of an envelope, right? Not difficult to do. All the action here is in step two, right? The actual loss. We're now going to say, I know how much the monopolist needs to lose to break even, okay? Now I want to do my predicted loss or actual loss. You'll see the HMGs refer to this as predicted loss, okay? And so let's talk about that, because in practice, that's where the rubber hits the road on critical loss and hypothetical monopolist test. Okay? For those of you who are graphical learners rather than sort of with words, you think about these two rectangles, the green being the gains from the price increase, right? I get that extra delta P, that extra margin on the sales I keep. And that red tall rectangle is the losses from the price increase. I raised the price from P to the higher P plus delta P, and I lost some quantity sold, right? I lost some quantity demanded. Well, that vertical rectangle is the revenue, the profit associated with those losses, right? And the horizontal is the gain, right? Where those two are equal to each other, then we've got our break-even unit, okay? So let's do a quick numerical example just to kind of work through the mechanics here. We know the firm's pre-merger margin. We have lots of sources for data. We submitted a second request. The firms, measure their own margin. We've got scanner data. We've calculated the margin. We've got a pre-merger margin of 45%, a SNP of 5%. Okay. So my break-even critical loss analysis, what do I need to know? If a hypothetical monopolist raises its price 5%, then it will be profitable so long as it loses less than 10% of its merger sales, right? So I've calculated my critical loss that's sort of break even, right? It's going to have to lose 10% of its sales in order to break even, given an increase in the margin of 5%, okay? Now, if we think about pre-merger actual loss, and we can talk about this a little bit more in a couple of slides, we can sort of from theory figure out the maximum critical loss, maximum actual loss. We know actual loss will be positive, right? We're going to lose sales, okay? But talking about magnitudes, we've got some other things we can do, and I'll sort of cover in later slides in just a moment. But the pre-merger actual loss, one of the nice things that comes out of economic theory is the Lerner index is this condition that tells us that the margin is equal to 1 over the elasticity of demand, right? So if I know the elasticity of demand, I can figure out the margin. If I know the margin, I can figure out the elasticity of demand. So as a matter of theory, I can start calculating things like with a 5% increase, given the elasticity of demand, I can figure out the quantity decrease, right? I know the slope of the demand curve, and I say if I increase 5%, the actual loss is going to be 11.1, right? Greater than the break-even critical loss, right? And it gives you sort of a rough sense of what people do with critical and actual loss. Now, I brought that 11.1 out of sort of throwing an elasticity of demand at you. In practice, we might be out estimating elasticity of demand, doing something more complicated to get those numbers, relying on other sources of data to get that to that 11.1, and not just the elasticity of demand, but all the action is going to be in trying to predict that actual loss and compare it to the break-even number. Just like on the hypothetical monopolist front, all of our action is going to be on predicting sources of customer substitution and where people go. So more things about critical loss in the SNP, you'll see this sort of general theoretical relationship. The higher the pre-merger margin, the lower the critical loss, right? You get the intuition. The critical loss gets smaller as the margins increase. Why? Well, as the margins increase, all of those unit sales lost, I lose a little bit more, right? I'm getting something an additional 5%, but I'm losing my 90% margin on all of those additional sales lost. So as the pre-merger margin goes up, it's taking fewer lost sales in order to offset the gains, right? Because each of those lost sales really matters to me when that unit sale with a 90% margin diverts, right? So it's sort of a general theoretical relationship that should sort of feel okay in terms of the intuition. And you'll hear people use these sorts of arguments. So this is a hypothetical type of argument, but one when I served at the FTC, you would hear this sort of thing all of the time. The margin earned by the firms is 30% with a snip of 5%. The critical loss is 14.3. We've got all of this extrinsic testimony that says the actual losses would be 16%. The 16 is bigger than the 14.3, and so the product marker must be larger, right? So critical loss, especially when used by the merging parties in this context, or the defendants, or what have you, will be, here are all of the reasons why actual loss is greater than critical, and you need to broaden the market. Right? And as an offensive weapon, the argument will be, no, the actual loss is much smaller than the critical loss for the following extrinsic evidence reasons: testimony, other quantitative type analysis. And don't think of the HMT or the CLA as types of evidence, right? We're going to run types of evidence through these analytical frameworks to make predictions about market definition. Again, not for the purpose of just calculating shares and making predictions based on market structure, but for teaching us something about which firms should be part of the set of competitive constraints that help us understand how this conduct impacts the competitive process, and which firms can we safely ignore when we do our more robust competitive effects analysis. Everything we've done, precursor to doing the competitive effects analysis, we're going to ask a lot of similar questions, right? And so if you can do market definition and ask these questions about the trade-offs between inframarginal sales and marginal sales, I'm going to do a lot of that again in unilateral effects and coordinated effects. A lot of the same logic sort of happening at different stages and using different sorts of evidence to make predictions. Okay, actual loss, again, our estimate. Actual loss is an estimate. We don't derive it on the blackboard. Theory tells us, look, it's negative. We know when you increase the price, you reduce sales, and we can bound it with economic theory. But lots of evidence is relevant here to estimating actual loss, and the HMGs reflect this, saying, look, we'll look at all of the evidence on customer substitution to figure out what will actually happen. Okay. A couple of last things to round out on critical loss analysis. One is where we are calculating the actual amount of lost sales. We're looking for diversion ratio evidence most of the time, right? So when we're calculating actual loss, what I'm really interested in is how will customers behave in response to the price increase, right? And I've not talked about diversion ratios yet, but it's a concept you're going to hear in market definition and competitive effects all of the time. Go back to my first coffee chart. We said, one of the key sort of innovations of modern antitrust as opposed to the structural approach is we count less on our fingers with the number of firms, and we start to care and pay attention to closeness of substitution. Diversion ratios are a way that we do this. Related to cross elasticities of demand for those of you with an economics background. But if you think back to that picture, and I've got Folgers and Starbucks far away from each other in product space, and I've got I've got Starbucks and Caribou close to each other in product space. We want to account for that difference. It's much more likely Caribou is a closer competitive constraint than Folgers. We ought to think differently about a Starbucks Folgers merger than a Starbucks Caribou merger, because at least the competitive constraint that's being lifted or eliminated by the Starbucks Caribou merger is probably more important than the competitive constraint that's relaxed if Starbucks buys Folgers, right? And we ought to be able to account for that. The structural approach doesn't do it. What do we do to measure closeness of competition, right? Diversion ratio is the primary measure. I've got a definition down there and a little example, again, using coffee. But a diversion ratio between two products, say Starbucks and Caribou, right? The percentage of unit sales lost by product one when its price rises that are captured by product two. So think about it this way. Starbucks raises its price 5%, and 20 people walk away and go to other stores, right? Some of them go to Caribou, some go to Dunkin', some go to Pete's Coffee, some leave and get tea, right? So out of the 20 unit sales, you see 2 people left to go water, not tea. 2 people left to go drink water. That's 2 out of the 20. 10% for my math people there, right? The diversion ratio between Starbucks and water in my hypothetical and unrealistic example here is 10%. Well, what about the diversion ratio between Starbucks and Caribou, our merging parties? 20 sales lost. That goes in my denominator of the diversion ratio. Well, what about my numerator? Well, 5 went to Caribou, 5 over 20. 25% is the diversion ratio between Starbucks and Caribou. And with Dunkin' Donuts, it would be 50% in the example, right? So diversion ratios are going to give this one simple statistic for capturing closeness of competition as perceived by consumers. The best way to answer how close substitutes are is not arguing subjectively and throwing stuff at each other and shouting about which type of coffee we like. It's finding out how consumers voted with their feet. And so the economic approach is sort of use data to answer that. And diversion ratios, you'll see, we'll be able to plug into things in unilateral effects and all sorts of competitive effects analysis. We'll talk about diversion ratios and how to get them. To sum up, the reason we define markets, not just to do market structure and coordinated effects, maybe to invoke the structural presumption afforded under the law in the US, the Philadelphia National Bank. We're still going to define markets and calculate shares, but the modern economic approach to understanding whether a merger creates market power that wouldn't exist otherwise is informed by market definition. We're asking what the pre-merger constraints are so we can study how the merger changes incentives or how the conduct changes pricing incentives that influence market prices and output, not just the firm's own ability, right? So a mistake to make inferences about the intensity of competition just from looking at price and marginal cost. That's sort of an artifact of relying on the perfect competition model. We don't want to do that. We want to ask in the real world, when a merger changes the incentives of a firm to compete, right? What happens? Is there demand substitution that defeats the price increase? What are the sources of constraints that we should be studying when we do competitive effects? When we do competitive effects, we might learn the merger also reduces marginal cost, and so price will go down. Maybe price will go up, but the market definition idea is not to answer those questions. The market definition concept is identify the relevant competitive constraints so that we can get it right when we get to competitive effects. We walked through the HMT and critical loss analysis. We introduced the idea of diversion ratios to measure closeness of competition. We've left open this question of where do diversion ratios come from, right? Sometimes firms measure themselves. Sometimes we'll have entry-exit experiments that allow us to estimate them. And you'll see that happen in lots of modern merger investigations and also in litigation where we get a real-world change, you know, Starbucks enters a market or exits a market, and we get to see where everybody switched and went, and we get to see something that looks like a real natural experiment that allows us to estimate diversion ratios and get actual consumer behavior to help us inform this question. Performs much better than holding up 2 different cups of coffee and sort of shouting and taking guesses about closeness of competition. And it's given some real analytical sort of rigor to how we do market definition. Some science to it, also some art, right? We've got SNPs that are arbitrary. We're still making some subjective judgments, but I hope this gave you a good sense and overview of the tools that we use to define markets. You'll see the concept come up again in other online videos, and I hope you enjoyed. Thanks.